was a time when I needed to have the latest and greatest smartphone. Regardless of whether there were still kinks to work out with, I just needed to have it. Forking over the investment was a satisfying thing back during those days, more so when there was a significant disparity between entry-level, mid-range, and flagship devices. Looking back now on it all, it's unbelievable to realize why I was so intent on upgrading each year, rather than waiting for my tier agreement with my carrier to end. Those were the days. In recent years, however, my desire to get the latest and greatest each year has been diminishing. You could argue that I've been increasingly jaded by all the competition floating around, but even with each new phone, each successor, each evolutionary iteration, I soon had this clear realization about what I really want in a phone, and that was just something that covers the bare essentials. Sure, others may have different priorities, but the more I kept on really uncovering what I use my smartphone for in my life, that's when it occurred to me that I don't need a flagship to satisfy my requirements. Honestly, the last smartphone that I bought was the iPhone SE back in the fall of 2016, the first iteration to be exact. Given the iPhone's history, I was pretty confident that I would obtain the same rich and intuitive experience that previous iPhones offered without having too many compromises in the process. And you know what? It was the second time it occurred to me that I didn't need to splurge $600 and up for a smartphone to experience something satisfying. And this brings me to my point of why my next phone won't be a flagship. Without question, the biggest drawback I feel about the majority of today's smartphones is that they're ridiculously expensive. Some folks will argue that inflation may have a direct impact on today's prices, which can range anywhere from $700 to $1,000. In comparison, flagships from 5 years ago on the average topped out at roughly $650. Those prices were still considerable, but looking at how the iPhone X and the Samsung Galaxy Note 9 currently start out at $1,000, the extra few $100s you'll need to shell out makes me cringe. For me, those few $100s could be spent elsewhere, or possibly saved up for something else entirely different. Sure, those $1,000 price smartphones may have the additional conveniences and features, but the question is whether they truly warrant the extra few $100s. If we're to look at the iPhone 8 versus the iPhone X, or even the Samsung Galaxy S9 and the Note 9, it does make me wonder if they're really worth the extra money. We can argue the bigger size, the addition of the S Pen, and even a dual camera implementation for the Note 9, but does it all equate to an additional few $100s over the Samsung Galaxy S9? Naturally, when a new smartphone is finally released, it's typical for last year's models to receive a generous price drop. It may not always be the case for the iPhone, but when you look at other Android smartphones, they tend to get the most love, often being given extra goodies in the form of BOGO offers, service discounts, gift cards, and much more. These are all incentives that I feel make last year's flagships far more logical to choose over their newer counterparts. It just makes for a more convincing option for me. If you haven't noticed yet, there's a particular trend that nearly every phone follows. There was a time several years ago when there was a huge difference in design between mid-rangers and flagships, but the gap has seemingly been leaped in the last year or so. Today's mid-range smartphones exhibit designs that could easily be mistaken for a flagship, especially when the glass meets metal designs became the standard for nearly every recent smartphone. Nowadays, it's super rare to find a phone that's constructed from plastic, which you may find in some entry-level models. Beyond aesthetics, build qualities have also been less defined between the various classes of smartphones. Previously, it was feasible to tell the difference between flagships and mid-rangers by just holding them, but that's no longer the case because manufacturers have perfected the recipe for crafting smartphones. Usually one can tell because a phone's construction would be on the cheap side, one that traditionally would come with creaky casings, low-quality materials, and be shoddily put together. But the reason why I fell in love with the iPhone SE versus some of its newer, more capable siblings was the fact that it did everything that those flagships could offer, but at the fraction of the price. From taking decent photos for social media to email replies and watching videos, the iPhone SE at the end of the day delivered the same level of completeness when it came to the basic essentials. And do you know the best part of it all? It's that there wasn't a huge difference with its overall performance, in terms of fluidness and responsiveness with basic tasks. This is crucial because I didn't feel that the iPhone 6s, which at the time was the superior spec iPhone when the SE was released, offered something greatly more in terms of accomplishing these essential functions we all carry out with our smartphones. Another critical area that defined the gap between flagships and mid-rangers was the performance between their cameras. Back then, it was instantly noticeable how flagship smartphones were dominant in this category, as they produced sharper, more detailed images in all lighting conditions across the board. Mid-rangers, to their credit, took decent-looking snapshots, but the performance under low light was complete garbage. Today, though, is a different story because at times it's difficult to tell the difference what is what when photos are taken under ideal situations. Sure, it's quite possible to spot the difference under low light where flagships prove their worth, but for most people who don't scrupulously put their stuff under the microscope, it's almost meaningless. So while I've been listing several reasons why my next phone won't be a new flagship, the flagship category now covers a significantly broader area than before. Take for example the OnePlus 6, which is one of the most impressive smartphones I've tested out and used for a great period of time this year. Part of the lure is its aggressive price point of $530, a figure that places it more in line into the mid-range category. At nearly the fraction of the cost of most traditional flagships, the OnePlus 6 is what I consider, at the moment, the only flagship caliber smartphone I'd consider purchasing and owning. The savings alone is appreciated, but more so when it doesn't skimp out with its performance either. If there's one thing that the iPhone SE has proven, it's that you can still have a great smartphone in what would be considered as an inferiorly spec'd device. It's not trying to win awards or set new records in the specs department, which is why I would fancy another one if it follows in the same footsteps. Ultimately though, if it's able to still maintain the same level of responsiveness, capture pleasant looking photos, and can get me through at least one day of normal usage with its battery, it's a solid contender for being my next smartphone purchase. Everyone has different priorities, and it's those priorities that help to dictate what phone you should get next. I personally don't have a need for a phone that can produce those faux bokeh effects with portrait shots, nor do I ever see myself ever using a phone in the pool without a waterproof case on it. Others, however, may not share the same sentiments, which is exactly why they may feel it's necessary for them to go with a flagship caliber device. Going back to my original and most pressing reason, the cost is something that plays heavily into my decision. When I think of how people easily hand over $1,000 for a smartphone, it shocks me because that's the same price as some decently spec'd convertible laptops, which you'd own not for just a year or two, but rather several years to really absorb the substantial investment. I would rather pay for a smartphone under or near the $500 range much more, seeing that it's not totally draining my pockets in one single transaction. But here's the question that's left on my mind. Are flagships overrated? And that is it for this video, guys. I hope you really enjoyed it. I hope it was informative. I know what I want in a smartphone next. What are some of your thoughts? Let me know. And if you guys want to learn more about any of the stuff I talked about in this video, you can check out our website, PhoneArena.com. This is John V, signing off.